Okay, we are the faithful few. And it's wonderful to have you still with us, and I hope we can have a nice discussion. We have anybody who hasn't submitted a written question yet, please do. I think given where we are and how few we are now, we can meld the last two sessions together. We're going to first begin with Martha McClintock and Bo Jacobs, our panelists who have waited so patiently, to give them their time to pose their comments and questions, maybe initially to Mr. Hayama and Mr. Iwasaki. So we'll spend the first bit doing that. And after that, certainly questions for Trisha and Mary too, and questions for Trisha and Mary from the audience. And let's see where we are then. Let's see, so we'll ask Martha first. Martha has so many distinctions, I'm not going to begin to name them. She's a member of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's indefatigably curious and creative about her research projects, and something I deeply, deeply appreciate more every year, rights to be understood and appreciated, questioned, appreciated in that way. And I think she's absolutely perfect for our theme today, because she has forever been interested in the relationship between the biological and social and cultural. So there's Martha, and then after her, Bo Jacobs, who's actually not far from here and where he was born and grew up, Skokie, but came to us from Hiroshima 2 days ago. He works at the Hiroshima Peace Institute. I think you saw a flyer for his latest book out there. He has probably been to more radiation-impacted sites in the world than anyone else around here. And what he does, I heard him describe this very tidily before, that he works on the non-epidemiological impact. That is to say, he's interested in what happens to communities and families when they live with the aftermath of nuclear testing, of nuclear disasters, transport, so many other ways in which our poor Earth and our ecosystem are contaminated. So begin with Martha and then Bo, and don't feel rushed. How about that?
Luxury.
Well, thank you so much. When Norma asked me to do this, I had to say yes. I am a good example of someone who's totally naive to this issue, other than I have lived from way before from the atomic bomb through Cuban Missile Crisis up to the moment, and I'm a scientist, so I come to this with fresh eyes and ears, and it's been fabulous. I really wanted to thank you. My first question is for both Professor Hayama and Dr. Iwasaki. You want to translate, or so far so good? Okay. In my field of science, we go for robustness. And I'm giving you this background, meaning with one experiment, you don't know something's true. Someone once said you need to show the same pattern with 7 independent methodologies, and when those are all taken together, you can finally say it's true. So I think that you've both, one from the perspective of art, filmography, and the other perspective from science and clinical practice, have both shown incredible robustness. You with your choice of so many subjects and pictures of the affected animals and the scientists and the citizens reporting. I mean, way more than 7, right? So I would say it's a phenomenon, right? That this has had an effect. And then your work, Professor Hayama, is done so beautifully. I would say probably the best of what little I read and have read about, because your use of control groups and your use of the change over time, your use of multiple different dependent measures is just terrific. So this is where you say, I didn't come here to hear you lecture, Professor McClintock. Came here to hear your question. So this is my question to the two of you, and I'd like to hear from both of you. Why does Norma Field, Professor Field, refer to your work collectively as controversial? As someone who comes from the outside, it's about as robust as it comes. So what's been your experience with your controversial work, and what do your critics say you have to do more than you've already done?
Thank you very much.
This is the,
全くこの専門家ではないので、ですからその放射線の専門家ではないので、ですから逆に僕らは病気が先にあって、だから研究のためにやってるのではないので、病気異常があったらそれはなぜだろうって考えるのが多分それが普通だと思うんですけど、ただそれに従っただけで。
He's wondering if it's controversial because he's not an expert. He's not an expert on radiation. He starts noticing illnesses, ill effects, and goes from there. He's not starting with research for the sake of research. He's thinking that's why maybe it's subjected to questioning and denial and suppression.
Well, I would say in reply that my work starts with just an observation. Most people do. And you're using the scientific method and controls and everything is elegant and beautiful. So they should say, ah.
Martha, we need to send you to Japan. We really do.
But politically, what's the driver? Yeah.
Should we hear from the director first, too?
Yes, yes.
岩崎監督からは。
私もわかりません。正直なところ。映画やってもあまり人は来てくれません。今葉山先生もおっしゃったように、僕も放射能に関しては素人というか無知に近いんですけど、僕の目線で映画を作ったら、おじいちゃんもおばあちゃんも子供も分かってくれるんじゃないかという視点で僕はこのテーマに取り組みました。特に動物に焦点を当てたのは人間だけじゃなくて、ありとあらゆる生き物は日本では一目一草とか言いますけれども、そういう生態系に影響を及ぼした恐ろしいことだと僕は直感的に感じまして、それをどれだけ映像にできるかということで、専門の科学者たちに応援してもらって、僕なりに解釈して見る人に分かりやすくといいますか、僕の目線で伝えるというように、心がけました。それは伝わったでしょうか。
I don't know either. I'm not just not a professional about radiation. My knowledge is virtually zero. I just, from what my experiences have been, I felt that something quite concerning was happening to animals and plants, not just human beings, but to the whole ecosystem. And I thought that if I could use my filmmaking skills, using my sightline, which is the sightline of an ordinary person, that my films would be understood by children and grandmas and grandpas, by other ordinary people. So I've been making these films, but not many people come to see them. But I hope that my aim of trying to, of what I've done with my own, my own perspective, what I am able to apprehend, relying on the help of specialists, I'm hoping that my concern for the ecosystem might have communicated itself to you today.
I also wonder, Trisha, do you want to chime in? Because Hanford things are also very controversial, and maybe after that we want to go.
Oh, thank you. I just want to say that every time people like me raise the issue of health harm from low-dose ionizing radiation, someone from the American Nuclear Society stands up with the same thing to say over and over. That could have been another cause, or might have been pesticide. They're very, very defensive. They're trying to preserve their livelihoods in the nuclear work they do. And my own father was a nuclear engineer, so I have plenty of practice within my family arguing these issues. So lots of politics involved.
Or Mary, like talking about gender and science.
Well, there's a bigger elephant, and that is that TEPCO owned the reactor, and yes, there's a lot of national treasure of the Japanese people going into this situation, but TEPCO is also being paid to clean up its mess. And it's a huge, huge operation in the tens and even hundreds of billions of dollars. And they have to be obviously doing a good job. I'm not saying that the Japanese people are the only people who believe in a good job, but believe me, Japanese people believe in a good job. And so they're out there paid to do this impossible task, and they have to therefore suppress any criticism of their task because it's impossible. And we heard it. I'm not going to repeat all the angles and views we heard about the reality of it. But the reality is not supported.
If I could just, is that on? Okay. Just add an anecdote that came to me as Trisha and I were talking. My father was a mechanical engineer, and he, at the end of his life, what his specialty was why metal breaks and how cracks in metal get propagated and what makes things snap and fall apart. And he got called into Idaho to an institute there to come up with models and ways of predicting of why the storage containers of radioactive waste are falling apart. And so just now, when I saw plastic bags, I said, hello? I just had to share that.
Can we put you on the next plane, Martha? Because of course, I mean, those are glorified garbage bags. And the more expensive ones were designed to last 5 years, I think. The lesser ones, 2 to 3 years. They've long been tearing, and of course there's, biomass in there. Sprouting, splitting, leaking, and presumably available to be caught on fire by lightning, etc. So yes, right, Hanford's containers are a real problem, but yeah, the plastic garbage bags. Right.
I want to ask a question, but first I wanted to point out one thing that struck me because it relates to my experience of the work that I've done in the field, and that is the 2 slides, Mary, that you showed, the one of nuclear tests and the other one of nuclear power plants. essentially you could also look at those as maps of the developed and developing world. They're maps of completely different worlds, and how nuclear technology, how humans encounter nuclear technology is very much based on wealth and class. For me, money is at the center of nuclear technology whenever we talk about nuclear weapons and nuclear power and nuclear recovery, for example, all the money going to my sense was that you were occasionally finding researchers working on marine assessment of water, assessment of birds, assessment of various things, and it was not that there were huge teams of them all over Japan. However, there were certainly huge teams of people decontaminating waste into those plastic bags everywhere you went. So that's a choice of where we spend our money and what the priorities are. And the priorities are not research, and the priorities are not necessarily even the well-being of people. But so that's actually one question I'd like to start, is that when you were filming, was you viewed the same people over several years in a row doing research, and was that because these were the only teams of people you could find doing research? Does this indicate that there are that few groups of researchers in the field doing measurements?
同じ科学者を使う意味でしょうか。そ
の人たちしか見つからないんでしょうか、そのフィールドでは。
つまり毎年同じ方たちに会っている、訪れている。で、はい、ジェイコブさんの質問では、その除染などに投じられた人材とお金は膨大であるけれども、研究している人はごく少なく見えるっていう、その
通りです。That's right. まあその同じ科学者は、つまりこの問題は一回一年ですぐ分かるテーマじゃないと思うんですね。ですので、継続できればずっと継続するのが一番いいと思います。データが蓄積されますし、10年くらいは続けた方がいいと思っています。でもなかなかそうもいきません。それと、何でしたっけ。僕は長い間ワイルドライフでいろんな科学者先生と付き合いがあったので、その人たちと、葉山先生が前からですし、今日はネズミを調査している山田さんも昔からの付き合いなので、そういう人たちに連絡取ってだんだん輪を広げてきています。でもやっぱり圧倒的に科学者は少ないと僕も感じています。それはなぜかと言われると、僕の責任じゃなくて国の責任だと思います。
Bo is absolutely right in noticing the enormous discrepancy between the labor power and the monies invested in activities like decontamination and the few people we see doing research. Of course, it's true. I've had my circles of scientists that I've cultivated over the years working on wildlife documentary. So I turned to them and relied on them to introduce me to other people and widen my circle. But it is also, and I keep going back to them because I believe it's important to accumulate data, that I think this has to go on for at least 10 years. But even that seems difficult. And it is absolutely true that the number of scientists engaged in this kind of work is very small. However, that is not my fault. That has to do with the policies of the Japanese government and the priorities.
If I may add on to that question, how the government plays out in terms of restricting certain kind of researches. Maybe Professor Hayama, and maybe we can compare that things in how things work in the United States, maybe Martha and Mary.
Yeah, that was actually close to my original question. Yeah.
私自身は圧力を感じたことは ないんですけど、サポートもしていただけないのが事実です。
I myself have never experienced pressure, but at the same time, I've never gotten support either.
水俣病はご存知でしょうかね。もう半世紀以上経ちますけど、あれについても因果関係、国自身が調査をしたことはないですし、まあ多分今回の原発の問題もそうだと思うんですけどね。ですからやはり待ってても時間が経てば全て分からなくなってしまうので、ですからたくさんの人が最初から立ち上がったんだと思います。
Maybe many of you know about the Minamata mercury poisoning disease. It's a half-century old. The government itself has never taken measures to research the causes. So I believe that waiting for the government to help us is pointless, and the longer we wait, the more difficult it is. And probably others have shared my view, and that's why we had scientists standing up to try to contribute to this effort. In the case of Fukushima, we can't be optimistic that the government is going to be helping with research on Fukushima.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry,
First,
sorry,
maybe
one
second.
one second.
So-
And then Trisha.
Yeah.
映画を作るにはやっぱり制作資金、お金がまず問題です。こういうテーマでスポンサーもつきませんので、どうするか、まず、その国との関係ですけども、文化庁というのがあります。ここでは芸術映画も含めて助成金を出しています。大体4分の1から1000万かかるとしたら2500万とか。これまで僕は映画を作って4、5回それを受けてまして、この原発テーマでも出してみました。果たしてこのテーマでも文化庁が出してくれるかということで、出しましたら、なぜか通っちゃったんです。それは第1回、第2回、第3回と3回続けて200万ですけど出ました。でそれを母体に映画を作ってきました。でも4作、5作目から出ませんでした。出ませんと採用されなかったんです。シノプシスといって、ドラマではしないようですけど、ドキュメンタリーの場合はあらすじを書いて出すんですね。こういうことを大体想定して、それをシノプシス、それが決め手になると思うんですけど、最初は3作が OK でした。で4作目からダメな理由も分かりません。ただ採用不採用したくないんです。理由は何も書いてません。
So, making films like these, you can't wait for corporate sponsors, and they're very expensive to make, of course. So we need money. I have needed funding, and there's a culture agency which, among other things, sponsors documentaries and other artistic cultural activities. In my previous documentaries on wildlife, I had gotten assistance from them. And I didn't know what it would be like with this series, and I was able to get funding from them, funding typically up to about 1/4 of the total costs for series 1, 2, and 3, but nothing at all for 4 and 5. They weren't even considered. You submit a synopsis to the agency, and all you learn, you're not given any reasons for why they accept or reject. You're just told that you've been rejected, so no money. So that's where he is now.
And Trisha, please.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to mention that in the United States we had Federal Advisory Committee Act advisory committees formed around many of the Manhattan Project sites, including Hanford. I served on the Hanford board. we asked for information on the other radionuclides to which we were exposed, and we asked for study of the health effects of those radionuclides. And our request was refused for various reasons, so all we ever learned about was radioiodine. That's the only dose we were given. And all they studied was thyroid disease and thyroid cancer. So I consider that resistance from the government. I just wanted to throw it
Yes, and it's also the only disease that's officially acknowledged by the West from Chernobyl, too. That is to say, the UN-affiliated bodies only have acknowledged thyroid cancer, children's thyroid cancer. So I guess it's now a safe one to acknowledge, perhaps. But even so, the Japanese government is very reluctant to. I'll just say it, I'm not a scientist, but I find it profoundly unscientific when people say, this cannot have been the cause, instead of saying, let's keep studying it. But these scientists get up in front of people and say, this, nope.
Yeah. Can I add one little point?
Yeah.
I'll keep it short.
No, go ahead.
3 Mile Island, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The claim was that, any number of claims, I'm not going to go there, but the point is that there was data collected by well-trained, lots of degrees, epidemiology, medical researchers, but they were told by a U.S. judge by the name of Rambo, believe it or not, they made a character to take her place in everybody's minds in Hollywood. But Judge Rambo ordered these researchers to assume that people had only received the amount of radiation that was legal. 100 millirems, 1 millisievert, was the maximum amount of radiation that anyone in the Harrisburg area could have gotten from 3 Mile Island by writ of pen by this judge. And it was Stephen Wing, who we've lost in the last couple of years, who went back into the data without the judge's writ of pen and found that the plume that was very well defined was an area where people got significantly higher doses than the rest of the area in the accident's radius, immediate radius, had 400% higher cancers. And the very interesting and as yet unresearched fact is that this was data collected 5 years, not 25 years, 5 years after the accident. So is there something about the triggering of latent cancers that were already ready to go that happened, but a 400% increase, prostate, breast, overall total cancers and lung cancer amongst those who were under that plume in that data that the judge said they couldn't attribute anything above the legal limit. And that's the United States of America.
And Martha?
No, I was just going to say there's a huge, I study breast cancer in people and mice and rats, and there's a huge literature in the 30s and the 40s, early 50s on effects of radiation on cancers. That was the initial way people triggered cancers in order to be able to study it. So I'm totally naive to this, but I do know that literature and scientifically controlled studies. So this is awakening my 60s self on the call.
So that was
Not surprised, but appalled nonetheless.
Martha, so radiation was used to induce cancer in animals in studies?
So in order, not necessarily because the interest was in radiation, but it was a way to trigger the cancers so that then people could learn about the biology of the progression of cancers.
Oh.
And then chemicals started being used, so.
And X-rays.
X-rays.
And if I can chime in.
Right.
Boy is a historian of science and technology, and you just give a talk in front of physics professors. So I wonder if you can also have some thoughts or insights here.
Yeah.
About America, and living in the United States, living in Japan, if science, how science works, or science world works?
Well, I have not studied the scientific community in Japan. That's not been part of what I've studied, even though I live there.
Right.
So I don't have any real expertise on that. But certainly, and one of the things that I spoke about the other day is that there's a difficult time in the scientific community frequently acknowledging the degree to which paradigms are socially constructed. And you can see that, Mary alluded to that in talking about the lifespan study, which restricts its inquiry to external radiation. But whenever that data is presented to people who have been in areas where there's been radioactive contamination, like Fukushima, they're given data about what the health outcomes would likely be, and that data is based entirely on external exposure. But as we saw in these films, it's internalizing particles that is really the danger for people in areas where plumes come down. That data is completely excluded from the lifespan study. But when the information is presented to people who have anxiety over the possibility that their children may be exposed or that they may be exposed, the information is presented to them as holistic. In other words, this is the definite, you will not have health effects because because your exposures to gamma radiation don't correlate to our study. And it's never qualified in a way that gives people the information that, well, we don't expect health effects from any external exposures. However, we can't tell you for sure that there will or will not be health effects from internalized exposures. And this creates tremendous anxiety and uncertainty in people. And so my own sense of the way that science should be practiced, especially as it interfaces with presenting scientific outcomes to the public, I think that in some cases, especially when industry employed people are talking, it is disingenuous, but I think frequently it's just the way the truth is constructed in scientific communities, that we don't necessarily need to, we're presenting this wonderful data and it's been refined and it's the outcome of a tremendous amount of inquiry. And so mentioning the ways that it doesn't answer the questions at hand is just left out.
Right, thank you. And when it comes to internal exposure, when Norma and I went to Japan, we have encountered some people who are very understanding of radiation exposure or who have knowledge of radiation exposure, but somehow does not admit to the internal exposure. So I wonder if Norma, I know you're not a panelist and I know you have already researched yourself, but I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about it, like the kind of ignoring or negligence of internal exposure in the Japanese community, or not scientific necessarily.
You're not talking about our Hiroshima experience.
I'm sort of touching upon that.
No, it is very. Once my layperson's understanding, once you understand that you don't have to be near an exploding bomb or an exploding reactor. You can just merely be going about your business, breathing and drinking and eating, that you can take in these little nuclear reactors, is how I think of them, inside your body, and they're targeting your organs at close distance. Once everybody understands that, who's going to be for nuclear power? I think it was from Kate Brown's book that Trisha referred to earlier, that government scientists and DuPont scientists were concerned about internal exposure from the very beginning at Hanford. And there's war, right? We're in a big rush, and what are we going to do? We can't. They were concerned about whether they had an obligation to inform the employees. And they decided, well, let's postpone that question. And that question has just been postponed and postponed and postponed and repressed. But I was going to throw out another aspect of why this research is controversial. And I think it's controversial because of the victims. The victims themselves who, if you have no choice about your plight in life, would you rather not be would you rather not be left alone and not be further informed about what's going on in your life, in your child's school lunch, the school lunch, which is to support recovery, is going to use locally produced foods, for instance. So I'm wondering also if Director Iwasaki didn't run into, he got a number of local people cooperating, but I wondered if he ran into any kind of resistance making this sort of film. There's a resistance to this kind of film, I know from other friends who make them. People, they really don't want to have their noses rubbed in their own possibility of exposure. It's really excruciating. And B, for many people, the most vulnerable people, their livelihood depends on this technology continuing, or they're being able to decontaminate, i.e. package contaminated stuff in plastic bags, move those bags around, and so forth and so on, right? So there's a huge resistance to this kind of research, to this kind of filmmaking from the most vulnerable people themselves. That you don't need, I mean, yes, the government, its own avowed nuclear reliant policy, the nuclear village, or as it's more often referred to in English, the nuclear mafia, is a global institution. They all seem to have manuals about what to tell people right away, so they don't get worried. You'd think it's all been translated and internalized. It's pretty amazing. It has been.
And they have meetings like this to train each other.
Yes, and they're trained and they don't. Anyway, so there's that huge force. But the part of it that I find most troubling and tragic is the victims themselves having to contribute to their further victimization.
And so maybe Mr. Iwasaki?
まず地元ではほとんど上映会が開かれません。働いてくれた人もいるんですけれども、人が集まらない場所が提供してくれない。福島で二本松というところで一回上映しただけで、この南相馬っていう最初入ったところではまだ上映していません。僕の感じでは、自分の置かれた状況を見たくない、認識したくないという心理が働いているんじゃないかと思います。残念ですけど。
そこまでいいですか？I can tell you that my films are not screened in Fukushima. Just once in Nihonmatsu, but the Minami Soma, no. People who have cooperated, they most often documentaries in Japan are screened, taken around the country by citizens groups who pay to rent the DVD or Blu-ray and gather interested citizens to do a screening. It's part of a movement. You screen and circulate documentaries as part of a movement. And our director was telling us how hard it has been for him to show this film in Fukushima itself. He suspects there's also a psychology of people just not wanting to see the conditions in which they are placed.
もう一つ言いますと、我々自主上映って上映会やるんですけど、試写会やりますね。マスメディアに呼んで試写会やるんですけど、マスメディアはほとんど来ません。来てもほとんど記事にならないんです。もう忘れたいんでしょうけど、風化という言葉は風化っていうんですけど、そっちの方向に全体が動いていて、見ようという動きがほとんど封鎖ではないですけど、マスメディアが書かないとやっぱり一般の人集まらないんですね。だから僕の知ってる友達とかそういう人は熱心に見に来てくれますけど、なかなか一般の人に広がりがないというのが一番問題です。
And the other part of it is the mass media. Of course, we have these citizen-sponsored screenings, but we have screenings and invite the media to the screenings. It is so hard to get people in the media to come to our screenings, even if they happen to come. Very hard for them to get to write about it. And so news doesn't spread. If we don't get written about, it's very hard for us to attract ordinary citizens. So yes, this is an often cited issue about how much the media are contributing to the forgetting of Fukushima.
And I also wonder, Mary, during your 5-week trip to Japan, talking about radiation, if you have similar experiences, like sometimes you have some group of people who is harder to penetrate or harder to come across your message.
There are so many stories because there are so many people.
Right.
And all of us have our own path in life. But I had a radiation accident years ago, and I was 25 years old in a research lab, and I had a lot of health consequences that are not in the books, and that's, I had to set them all aside when I got my job at Nuclear Information Resource Service because I didn't want to spend the time on me. I wanted to spend the time on the bad policies and get to work already, because one of the best medicines for me, for my incredible rage about what happened to me, was to work, was to get involved, to try to make a difference, to be an activist. It was medicine for me. And so while I understand and honor people for whom that is not the path, I had the great good fortune to be a resource to women in Japan, both in Fukushima Prefecture and also those who had moved out. They were called mamas meetings, so they were gender-specific women. Every once in a while there'd be a man who was sort of around taking care of kids maybe, while the mamas were having their tea parties with me. And I was scheduled to have 2, but they went so amazingly well that they self-organized ahead of me on this tour that we were doing. And I had 23 meetings over the course of the 5 weeks because women needed to come together with an outsider, someone from the United States who would say categorically, you're not crazy. What you're telling me is real, I hear it. That's pretty much the main message that happened in those 23 meetings. But sometimes there would be a spark of realization that they could do something. And when that spark would get going, that sense of, oh, maybe we could make a little difference somehow, it sort of becomes contagious. And I've heard after the tour of a number of initiatives that happened, and many of them were little kernels that were already happening. I'm not saying my going was the source, but things like the Mama's Clinic and Mama Becquerel that functions in the prefecture, bringing women together once a week. That was sort of an opportunity then for more women to get involved in those things. They heard about them at these Mama's meetings. And I do think that it's kind of lethal as a living being to just huddle up and go like this. I just don't think that's as healthy as engagement. And so I really adore these films because they are films of the engaged people. And that, I think, can grow, not the opposite.
Thank you.
Yeah, please, Martha? Were you raising your hand? Not really. I just wanted to say about the main and only woman featured in the films today of the Mama's Radiation Lab, and they're very much behind the what we want to collect funds for, the Thyroid Cancer Children's Fund. I can give you an idea of victimization. When the first parents, this was billed as a coming out, the first parents of children who'd had to have thyroid cancer surgery came out, I thought, this is amazing. They're going to come before the cameras. A big room with journalists in one room. Well, it turned out the dads, they were just dads, were in one room in Fukushima, and the camera only showed them from their neck to their knees. So it's as if the parents of children who'd had thyroid cancer surgery had done something wrong, who needed to be ashamed of showing their faces. And we haven't talked about this, but I think Yuki would agree that one of the great legacies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is the propensity to discriminate. And I know Bo has some choice words about that. Vast of American Downwinders get discriminated against, but in marriage and job. And that is another powerful, powerful force in why the victims are so reluctant to come forth. I wanted to turn to some of the questions we began, but I really want to go back to Bo and Martha and get more, stuff out of them. I'm sure they have other questions and comments, maybe new thoughts from your own work or whatever.
I'll say a few things, and that is that having studied a lot of communities affected by radiation, and for me that's primarily nuclear test site communities and nuclear production communities like Hanford, there's a lot of ways in which keeping people confused about information is a strategy. If you have some people if you have a community that is at odds with itself, you have a community that's politically ineffective. So allowing all kinds of information, repressing some information, amplifying the craziest of the information you don't like, for example, all of us have heard all of Japan should be evacuated, the Pacific Ocean is dead. Amplifying those voices, creating contention around truth is really a strategy of keeping people from being able to organize and coalesce. And the same thing is true when it comes to compensation. It's the case in a lot of communities that if you compensate some people and you don't compensate other people, you now have people who are angry at each other. This is a strategy of keeping communities divided as well. And so there's a lot of ways in which people who find, this is especially true in the developed world where people have a sense of agency and a sense of rights. If you keep people mad at each other and you keep them sort of reacting constantly to different, conflicting, extreme levels of information, they're much easier to manage. And this is, you can, having watched this in a lot of communities, for me and my research colleague from Australia who I work with, when Fukushima happened, we'd been in the middle of this project we're working on, the Global Hibakusha project. We've been in the middle of it for years. And we'd seen this discourse and these strategies in all kinds of communities. And in Fukushima, we could just watch it in slow motion unfold. And one of the reasons that I would argue too that this happens is that when you're in a position of having to manage, as the Japanese government is, having to manage the unmanageable, which is this site will not be remediated for decades and decades and decades, a century easily. There'll be ongoing problems. It's not very easy to achieve physical goals with the actual accident itself. It's really frequently the case for administrative bodies to turn to public relations, because public relations is an arena in which you can set out goals and achieve them and accomplish things. So you find very fine-tuned public relations efforts after radiation exposure, and they accompany and in a sense block the vision of the incredibly bogged down, incomplete, dysfunctional physical efforts being done at remediation.
Martha, would you mind giving us something?
Yeah, okay, so just building on what you said and your interest in the non-epidemiological social effects, I just wanted to comment that as you described, particularly given the tsunami, the effect of the fracture of families and communities, either from deaths in the tsunami or from people being located differently. I mean, families, small family units might be together, but the classic 3-generational families with the grandparents taking care of the kids and that kind of thing is broken apart. And in my field, one of the really fascinating findings, and this has to do with epigenetics, is that stress and this is something I study too, the stress of social isolation. And by social isolation, I don't just mean being alone. I mean feeling lonely, feeling that you don't have the supports to buffer you, not from the major stress of the first event, but just everyday stress. How do you, long lines somewhere, or how getting lost or whatever. Social supports buffer you against that stress. And there's some very good animal work now that shows that when mothers, this pulls you in, Mary, experience those kinds of stressors, it affects not only how they parent, that affects their biology, but it also affects how they parent, and then through epigenetic mechanisms affects the health of the next generation. So these macro factors that you're talking about, it's easy to think of them as just social or political and quite divorced from health. In fact, there's good data now that there's a pretty direct line from that. Like I often say, how does it get under the skin? How does the social world get under the skin to affect physiology in a way that then affects gene expression or epigenetic effects in cells? So I think it's fabulous that you're studying that, and if we were to do work and research, it would be fabulous to combine those two levels of analysis, to broaden the definition of health, to be way beyond just thyroid cancers, because these effects affect the immune system, that's well established, which is involved in cancer, but a lot of other things. To include that, and then also to include the social disruption, and then the individual's beliefs, mind, sense of disconnect, stress of being disconnected from ancestors, from family, from friends, from support. So I think it really all fits together across the three levels.
Absolutely. And when you take a population, for example, the mothers in Fukushima, and you say that all of their problems and all of their health problems come from anxiety, come from radiophobia, you're perpetuating the thing you're describing and blaming them for it.
Right. So victimizing the victim makes the underlying health disease process worse.
Yes,
absolutely.
But it also shifts the perception of others that it's not coming from the radiation.
Right. It's just all in your head.
Yeah.
And I have spent my career trying to embody all in your head.
Well, thank you for doing that.
I need to take it to the next layer that is being communicated, and I'm sure you know this, but mothers are being told that if their children are ill, it is because the mother is anxious.
Yes.
And so not only is she being re-victimized herself, but she's guilty of creating the thing that she's seeking help for. And this was reported to me over and over and over by both women in the prefecture and women who had chosen to leave.
And so that's why these groups that you're forming are really part of the solution, not just for transferring the information, but for reducing their stress. Support.
Yeah.
Well, actually, we just slid into a question from an audience member about epigenetic effects, which were raised by an emeritus professor at Tokyo University in episode number 5. And Martha beautifully addressed that else. Mr. Hayama doesn't think it applies to him at the moment, but we shall see. Anything else anyone wants to say before we go to questions from the audience?
I have one very short anecdote that to me is illustrative of the position that mothers find themselves in. This is a story told to me by a friend in Fukushima City who ran a daycare, The kids at the daycare were playing in a small lot, beside the building, and one of the children had fallen and skinned his knee. The mothers were extremely worried that he potentially internalized particles through that cut, and created a small model child, the size of that child, put double-sided tape on this model and knocked it over repeatedly in this same yard, and then took the tape to measure it with Geiger counters to try to determine for themselves if there was significant risk that this child had internalized a particle through this accident. And so here you have people who have received information or studied enough to understand the dangers of internalizing particles, information they're not being given formally, and so they're simply having to find means of creating a sense of control and a sense of information and safety in a void of, they're clearly well aware that there are dangers to their children, that they don't have information about how best to protect them, and people are, this is the kind of thing people have to do to find any sense of comfort in the midst of this onslaught of misinformation and victim blaming.
I have thought of a question percolated up for Dr. Hayama, just because you just said that you didn't think epigenetics were necessarily part of what you're studying, which I understand, but I have read that the research on effects of radiation exposure, low levels of radiation exposure, studied under controlled laboratory conditions, is much less sensitive. That studying animals in the wild, as you do, and studying the diversity of species, as you've shown us in the films, the sensitivity curve is actually shifted significantly and dramatically, so that the idea of coming up with a certain level, what that means is that you would have more disease, more defects for animals living in the wild than you would in a controlled situation. And I'm just wondering if that makes sense to your maybe because in the wild, it's, as you so elegantly put, in the winter, more dust and eating bark, for example, where things have concentrated. The whole point is it's not super controlled and therefore socially constructed, right? But you're letting nature be complex in all its wonders, and therefore seeing the problem writ large and more starkly.
Difficult for answers. ただ、我々はだから研究室でラボで実験をして、でそれと比較して影響を調べればいいんでしょうけど、やっぱりあまりにも大変だし、それからもう一つは生き物っていうのは一つ、例えば放射能だけじゃなくてさまざまな化学物質だとかさまざまな影響を受けながら生きているので、ですから要するに放射線を浴びた野生の個体と浴びてない野生の個体で比較するのが多分一番正しいだろうというふうに考えています。
So probably it would be best to be able to compare animals in the laboratory and animals in the wild. But another consideration is the fact that living things aren't just exposed to radiation, and that they're also exposed to chemical substances and whatnot. And so that kind of one-on-one measure is, I mean, there's a limit to it, but he would, at the moment, he's trying to compare organisms that have been exposed to radiation with those that have not. But I think basically he was agreeing, in fact, with.
Right. Well, that's why I think his work is so wonderful.
Can I interject one question here? Since we are talking about the nuclear waste, which is the end product of nuclear materials, I have a question here about the beginning, which is please talk about what was left out of the map, namely uranium mining that will include the third world as well as Africa. So if someone could answer or respond to this question.
Yeah, I would say that uranium mining communities, which are, as you pointed out, the beginning of the nuclear fuel cycle, are devastated, have been devastated by the history of their exposures, especially in the early days. Uranium mining was primarily in Africa and in northern Canada. And in those communities, there were no safety protocols at all. There was almost no information about the dangers of the uranium being mined. So you'd have miners covered in material coming home and just hanging the clothes up inside. No safety protocols, especially because this was all this kind of labor is being undertaken by very, very poor communities. And so I'm not sure exactly about current uranium mining practices in places like Iranian and Kazakhstan, Australia and Kazakhstan, and other places where it's developed a lot since then. But I know that the history of uranium mining in the American Southwest, in northwestern Canada, and in Africa has just been a brutal history. There's a documentary about the village where the Dene people live up in northern Canada, and the documentary's name is Village of Widows, because all the men had died from internalizing particles.
Okay, thank you.
We have monkeys are very popular. Confirming.
Right.
So there are a batch of questions from Mr. Hayama.
You shall not in this.
Yeah, there's a couple
There's one of them.
questions about monkeys.
Monkeys,
So
yeah.
Let's do some monkey questions.
Can I say one? I just noticed Dr. Hayama's necktie is a monkey print on it.
Oh.
It's the cutest tie ever.
Okay, so this is one of the questions. In regard to the higher levels of radiation found among wildlife during winter months, did you find any correlation of the observation to the amount of radiation accumulated in snow?
雪はあまり汚染されてない、それで基本的にはさっき山田さんがネズミの研究で土の中にセシウムがどんどん溜まっている。おそらくそれが日本の冬は乾燥しているので、それが北風で舞い上がってで大気効果物としてまた降ってきているんですね。だから冬の間の方が効果物のセシウム濃度が非常に高い。だからそれを食べ物と一緒に取り込んでいるんじゃないかなと思います。
In fact, snow is not much contaminated. We saw in the film Mr. Yamada, who studies field mice that who eat the. Let me backtrack. Japanese winters are very dry, meaning that the soil is the wind from the north blows up the surface soil, resuspends, particularly the high concentrations of cesium in the soil, and then the resuspension leads to fallout again. And the mice eat those foods, and that's probably why how we can account for high levels of radiation in the winter months more than the snow.
Shall we continue monkey question? Okay, there's another one. Do the monkeys at the Iitate high-dose area have the same hematologic findings as those near Fukushima City, which is lower dose area?
その要するに制限区域内、高線量地域でその猿の捕獲自体が非常に少ないので、ですから比較のしようが今のところないんですね。ただ、何例かは他の研究者が調べてますけど、そのデータを聞く限りは同じ傾向がありました。
Well, it's hard to find monkeys in the restricted areas, so we don't have the data to really make that sort of comparison. But other researchers are finding a correlation to high levels.
Do we have other questions?
Oh, the tag one? Should I?
Just answer the
So the question is again like a monkey question number 3. Are the monkeys tagged? タグがついているか
福島市の場合はだいたい20から30群れが生息しているんですけど、被害を出す群れですね。で、その被害を出す群れの行動を監視する必要があるので、福島市が群れのメスを、大人のメスを捕獲して、電波発信機を全部つけています。それで毎日監視をしています。
So in the case of Fukushima City, there are 20 to 30 troops, and because they cause a lot of havoc, Fukushima City captures the females and tags them as something that emits radio waves so that their movements can be monitored.
I'm going to run out of questions.
Well, there's one. I have a pair that are related. One is McKinsey, the consulting firm, advised General Electric to build nuclear reactors in inappropriate places. Why aren't they out of business? And why isn't General Electric being held financially accountable for building nuclear power plants in inappropriate places in Fukushima?
Part of my honor of the trip in 2016 was to have 3 weeks overlap with Arnie Gunderson of Fairwinds Education. If you don't know their website, Fairwinds has an E in the middle. And it's Arnie who left the nuclear industry and his wife Maggie, who are now educating from a very interesting perspective. Arnie was the vice president in charge of quality control in a major nuclear corporation and consulted with GE during the development of the MARC reactors. And so it was very interesting for him to be coming to Japan. He'd been once before, but coming back for a longer time. And he spoke a lot about his own personal experience of encountering what had happened in Fukushima with a reactor that he helped design here in Chicago. That's where the engineers were who designed that reactor here in this town. So I think it's very appropriate we're having this conversation here. I think these conversations need to spread out from here. I think the question of taking responsibility is extremely important. I think that General Electric needs to absolutely be brought into the question. And then I'm going to share one little insight because I was so incredibly angry about all of this myself that I had to remember that in 1972 I was a very young college student at Grand Valley State College in an experimental program where we had a class on radical theories. And one of the radical theories in 1972, only 2 years after Fukushima was built as a reactor in Japan, was not even called plate tectonics yet. Continental drift was a radical theory in 1972. So was greenhouse gases and large impacts. We did not yet know that the dinosaurs had gone down to a large impact. So the original responsibility must be factored, but then there are generations of professionals who come behind and who could now see that a baby buggy was in the middle of an interstate and didn't bother to say the emperor has no clothes, let's get the damned baby buggy off the interstate, right? And so that goes smack dab to institutions like the one we're sitting in, where colleagues do not have the ovaries to stand up and say, hey, let's talk about this. What does this mean? What does it really mean? Like, what would it mean if? Because it's that level of engagement that is required right now. If we don't, I mean, I don't want this to be a downer session. We can. We will. But only if we do, right? And there's so many dimensions of that set of little references I just made. Not only radiation, not only nuclear weapons, not only nuclear reactors. There's so many layers right now where we have to find those gonads and care about them. And so I'm going to now tag one little insight that has taken me for a really long time to get. We could spend a whole semester on the ways in which the lifespan study is not representative. I agree. One of the ways is that every single gonad in that study was never pre-exposed. There weren't lots of medical x-rays and dental x-rays and fallout from all the weapons that came later in the people who were exposed in August of 1945. They were a fresh set. And not a single one of us is a fresh set anymore. All of the gonads have had exposure. And every woman who is pregnant with a girl has in that developing fetus, in the process, the eggs that will be the grandchildren. So there's 3 generations there. And unless and until we get it that we have to stand up to General Electric, located at that time here in this city, sponsoring things going on in this institution, and really get down and say, how can we do this better? What's at stake? We're just, like, we are halfway down that cliff, but can we grab something? I think we can.
Comment on GE, if you don't mind. Unfortunately, my father was a General Electric nuclear engineer.
He was one of our colleagues.
Yes, and but I did want to say that General Electric was one of the 3 contractors sued in the Hanford Downwinder litigation. And because of Price Anderson's indemnification provisions, the national treasurer paid for their defense against the Downwinders. So I think the law needs to be changed. I'm certainly ready to help do that. Price Anderson has not. It was supposed to be an efficient method of compensating, victims of nuclear incidents, and it turned out to be an efficient method of funding the defense. So anyway, I did want to tell you there was one instance where GE was sued, but not successfully. But
Super. I think Mary and Trisha have made wonderful final salvos, and I wonder if we could just ask each participant to say one thing they want the audience to take away today.
You want us to go that way?
Whatever order.
I'll jump right in front and say one thing, which is that as a historian who has primarily studied nuclear exposures in the 50s and the 60s, one of the things that is most striking to me about the Fukushima nuclear disaster is the degree to which citizens have taken control of information. That is unprecedented. They've used new technologies. They've used social networking in all kinds of ways around the world. And because of efforts like that, we as a collective, the human species, have become more powerful as we face these incidents in the future. And it'll be harder for it to be hidden what the levels of radiation and what the exposures are. It'll be harder for it to be hidden what kinds of health outcomes have come in the past from these kinds of incidents. And so while we still find ourselves politically in roughly the same situation in relationship to the nuclear industry, to the nuclear weapon states, we have actively taken steps to become more powerful and to become more united. And that's one outcome of this event that is creating a stronger social bond and network to respond to these things in the future.
Great. I just want, I realized I stopped, I got distracted mid-sentence. That radiation monitoring clinic that we saw in episode 5, where we had the one woman featured in this series, it's an extraordinary place, right? She said that her previous resume only contained one line for work. She'd worked for the designer, fashion designer, Issei Miyake. And then she just launches this whole thing, including beta research, which is very hard to do, with expensive equipment from Finland and Germany, and the CEOs of those companies come because they publish peer-reviewed research on the one hand. On the other hand, they're right there where there are lots of nuclear workers. And they're right there, you know, one could say, they're stirring up anxiety, but no, they've created a place where mothers can bring their children. They also, you can imagine, like any citizens organization, they could use any bit of money they can get. They have refused to charge more than, I think, 1,000 yen, like $10 for whole body counting for the workers. Why? Because right now the companies will pay. They said, but if we keep the fee for whole body counting low, then maybe these workers will continue to come back after they have to leave their jobs. And so this way of being in the community, knowing that they can really exacerbate anxiety, but refusing to give in to that and rather to provide this wonderful, welcoming, safe place, they have even opened up an internal clinic, right? First non-for-profit organization, citizens group in Japan that's opened up its own clinic. So it is an extraordinary thing that's happened. And an ideal workplace, right? Non-hierarchical, we hire women. The men happen to do the lab, but they are respected, but no more than the women. And mothers who are worried about their children's schoolyard soil because the city will no longer measure, can bring in and are guided in measuring schoolyard soil levels. Okay, next. Who's going next?
Or whoever. Or Martha?
So I'm struck by your phrase, socially constructed science, and that phrase has often been used to imply bias and sort of a nefarious purpose by some people.
That's especially current.
Especially current. That's the story. I only know for my lifetime. But thank you. But I think good science can be done, though there's a formal word for it, but by taking what people notice, as you did, and what the film has shown us, and the insights of the diseases, right, and do community-based participatory research to fine-tune and hone what are the hypotheses that should be tested. And so if I were to take this group, right, I would say, all right, what needs to be done? You know, what is the ideal science? It will again be socially constructed, but that's okay. That's science keeps going forward that way. And the point is to broaden the community that's giving input into the design of the data that's collected and then how it's interpreted.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I just wanted to say that I totally feel good about being with this group of people, that I don't always feel supported, and this is one of those rare times, and it's so nice. And I'd also like the public beyond us to know about these issues we're discussing, because I'll talk about Hanford and people won't have heard of it, or you mentioned Fukushima and they say, isn't that over? You know, so how to reach out to the general public and the policy makers who are the ones who control a lot of the money, you know. So anyway, it's just a question, it's not an answer or anything, or a brilliant statement.
Thank you. Mary?
I shared that one woman asked me a question and my mentor told me how to answer it. I didn't get a chance to share that the diplomats at the UN picked it all up and helped use it to lob that ball into the new nuclear ban treaty, which is just also an incredible honor to have contributed to that effort. But there's a need now to move the needle on clinicians and medical schools and eventually those regulators who only, acknowledge that they use the reference man. And by the way, reference man is harmed by radiation. But reference man can't have babies by himself. And so I'm trying personally to figure out how to move the needle on sharing this awareness, because there's one other guy who looked at this, Dr. Arjun Makajani, and there's me. And neither of us have published in peer review, and we need someone else to do that because neither of us. Anyway, long story short, I had one person come up to me and say she's interested in talking more, and that was exciting. And if anybody else is, I would love you to contact me through the handout or Norma or whatever, because this has to spread out. So thank you for listening today.
Thank you.
まず最初にアメリカの方々がこんなに福島を覚えていてくださって本当に心から感謝したいと思います。でも日本ではもうここも去年ぐらいからですかね、全くこういうイベントがなくなって、我々も話す機会もあまりないんですけれども、ただとても勇気づけられました。これからも頑張っていきたいと思います。本当にありがとうございました。
It is hard for me to believe that there's so many people in the United States who care about Fukushima in this way. In Japan, over the past several years, interest is drastically diminished. People like me don't have many opportunities to speak. I feel enormously encouraged, heartened by you, and want to thank you deeply.
And lastly, Trisha Iwasaki, Director of the film.
これまでは映画を作ることに、力を注いできたんですけども、これからは見てもらう方にも力を入れていきたいと思います。この映画を見てですね、ある人に言われました。それは双葉町という原発に近いところの元町長で糸川さんということですけど、僕の体調を見て、これは放射能のせいだからもう行くなって言われたんです。それは証明はできないですけど、そう言われるとなんとなくそんな気もしてきたんですけど、僕の体調を壊したのは年のせいだ、加齢だと思っていました。それはさておいても、やっぱり作ったからには見せていくという努力をしていかないといけないと、僕は監督としての立場ともありますけど、プロデューサーの立場でもあるんです。プロデューサーの力が弱いですね。そういう意味で、今回、葉山さんがおっしゃったように、海外で初めてこういう上映会というイベントできたので、非常に嬉しく思っています。感謝しております。ありがとうございました。
I've been putting all my energy into making movies up to now, and I think that it's my obligation to try to make sure they get seen, to put energy into getting these films seen. Recently, the former mayor of Futaba village, Mayor Itogawa, who became very famous after the initial disaster, looked at Director Iwasaki. And I think you get a sense of how strong his voice is in the films. He narrated them all himself in the Japanese versions. And he said, the former mayor looked at him and said, "You've got to stop going there. You've gotten so weakened because of the radiation. Don't go there anymore." And a part of me says, maybe that's it. I tend to think it's age. But in any case, here I am. I've made these movies. I'm not just the director, but also the producer. Producers aren't very powerful. But, I'm so grateful to have had this first chance to have these films screened overseas here. And so I am very, very grateful to all of you. I would really like to give us all a hand for being so receptive, so respectful and supportive. And every single person on our panel today, it's very rare for me to see people listening to each other this carefully and developing a conversation. So I think this was a wonderful event at the University of Chicago on the 75th anniversary of the first nuclear chain reaction. Thank you all so much.